Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our webinar series at Climate Action Pakistan. Today with us, we have Christian Schiller, who is my colleague. Um, so before I give it to Christian and he introduced himself, I just want to introduce the topic for today. So today we're going to talk about plastics, but differently. Today we aim to discuss the solution of it and not discuss the problem at all. It might come along, but then we'll just be talking only about the solutions. Welcome, Christian.
Hi, Lala. Thanks for having me. And hi, everybody.
Yeah. Please introduce yourself to our audience in Pakistan.
So, yeah, my name is Christian Schiller, and I'm the founder and CEO of Cirplus. Cirplus is a startup that was founded 6 years ago in Hamburg, Germany, and we are an AI-based procurement platform for recycled plastics.
There was so much in the introduction in itself, but I'll come back to all AI and procurement later on. So let's break down today's discussion into three main parts: circular, plastics, and economy. So let's start with circular. So what is circular and what is not circular?
So, yeah, I think in contrast to circularity, there's linearity, right? So it's just
Mhm.
another, a Latin word, I guess, for something that how the world economy operates. And that is how basically predominantly every company is thinking today about using its plastic products. That is, you make it, you use it, and then you dispose it. You don't really think about reuse or recycling simply because it is so much cheaper for companies to just buy new plastics rather than thinking about how do I get old plastic back, how do I get the waste back, how can we can then recycle it because there's obviously process needed to recycling. That all that adds up to costs. And in a world where it's virgin, so-called virgin plastic, new plastic is abundantly available and very cheap.
Mhm.
It's a simple business calculation for all businesses around the world that to just sort of prefer virgin plastic over recycled plastics. And that is why this industry can be called linear and not circular, because circular would be exactly the opposite, where companies, rather than completely using virgin all the time, would actually use old plastic over and over until you can no more. That is the circular idea, actually.
Okay, so like what I get from it that we get a plastic product, we produce it, we use it, and then it comes back into some other form and stays in there. So it sounds simple to me.
Yes,
I
I mean
mean,
it is
okay.
exactly. I mean it's at the outset it's simple like that, but of course once you get into the detail you realize how complex plastic is as a product, right? When I started out, I was similar Lala. I thought, it's just easier. It's plastic, right? I mean, it's just
Yeah.
but then today, there's something like more than 4,000 grades of plastics commercially available, and that number is actually increasing because as it is an artificial material that humans have made out of hydrocarbons, there's almost no limit to new types of plastics. And of course, that makes the material, almost infinitively versatile and useful for any kind of application. But also, it makes it very hard to then how do we keep this material in the loop? Because as you can imagine, the plastic built into an airplane wing is quite
Mhm.
different to the plastic built into a computer, is quite different to the plastic built into a plastic packaging. But all of this eventually becomes waste, right? All of these
Mhm.
products. And then how do you make sense of those streams again, those waste streams first and foremost, to then create enough consistent feedstock that you can actually recycle it in a useful enough quality, and so Lala,
Mhm.
like just to add maybe the first layer of complexity here, it actually starts way before, circular economy enthusiasts always say circularity starts at the design phase of a product. Yeah, because if
Mhm.
you don't design the product to be reused, recycled, etc., then you almost have no chance at the end of
Yeah.
making something useful out of the waste stream again.
Mhm. Okay, we'll come back to circular model of it, but then like because you already introduced hydrocarbons into the discussion, can you please tell our audience how plastics is made?
Yeah, as the name suggests, right? Hydrocarbons. So there's a lot of for those chemist geeks among your listeners. So it's a lot of H and C atoms that are assembled in a way. So carbon and hydrogen. assembled in
Hmm.
a way that form long chains, so-called polymers. And depending on how the exact composition is, you have different types of plastics. But essentially, that's the main categories of plastics is hydrocarbons. And then amongst, so it's a product derived from fossil fuels today. 99% of all plastics produced today is derived from fossil fuel, from crude oil.
Wow.
So crude oil is the input material of petrochemical refining, and a lot of products still go into transportation and heating, but less and less so because we are moving away from fossil-based transportation. We're moving away from fossil-based heating systems. So um, I always like to say crude oil still finds its way into the economy, and plastic is then another major outlet for crude oil to be refined into plastic products. And sort of to add on that, then so you come out of a petrochemical refinery, what was crude oil now comes out as the building blocks of plastics. Let's call them ethylene and propylene, the major two ones, and then they're being further polymerized as the industry jargon goes. So you basically then put this into a production that so you build those long chain of hydrocarbons, and that ultimately become plastics, virgin plastics, and that's is what the world economy is predominantly relying on. Again, today, 99% of the world's plastic production is based on fossil fuel, meaning it comes from crude oil, and that is the
Can
products.
you, yeah, can you give us by an example or show, so how much fossil fuels like goes into plastic, making plastics versus something else like industry or so I just want to get an idea of how much fossil fuels are going into making new virgin plastics.
Okay, so if you look at the big split between, let's
Yeah,
say, heating products, transportation products, and then
yeah, something like
plastic
that.
products. We're talking plastics today is still in the lower, like 20%, 15% of a, let's say, a barrel of crude oil goes into plastics, but that percentage is predicted to shift toward 50% over the next 20 to 30 years, precisely for the trends that I mentioned earlier, that less and
Wow.
less product will go into the categories of transportation and heating. So yeah, it's very much a strong growth outlet for the petrochemical industry is the plastic industry. And that, of course, Lala, is, even though we're going to talk about solutions today, is of course
Yeah.
a driver of the problem, right? Because if we are producing more and more plastics with a strong growth trajectory until 2040, 2050, and we haven't closed the loop for plastic entry in the environment, then you don't have to be a mathematical wizard to imagine that, all right, we're producing more and more. We
Yeah.
haven't really closed the loop, so more and more waste is going to end up in the environment.
Okay. I'll try to phrase my next question from the solution angle. How can we be talking more about the crude oil or fossil fuels going into plastics at bigger platforms like COP and other climate-related conferences? Because while phasing out for the energy causes has been still a new thing. So like this seems if it's 20% today going to 50%, so I can sense it's a problem. And I haven't heard this discussion very like clearly anywhere else. Like, I mean, it would be
Mm.
between the lines, definitely, but then how can we start this discussion?
I mean, the industry itself has started talking about it because obviously
Mhm.
unlike carbon, I'd say that kind of, or carbon dioxide, which we can't really see how we emit it, right? We just measure it that it gets more and more. You can actually see the emissions of the plastic industry, right? Which is plastic waste. You can, in economies mostly affected, that you cannot close your eyes anymore because
Yeah,
plastic products now end up anywhere in the world, as you know, from the Mariana Trench to the Mount Everest to the Arctic, everywhere. Um, as a little side note, right? Even historians are considering to call our age the Plasticine, as a
yeah.
definition of our time, because it's a material that has only been introduced by us since the
Hmm.
1950s into the planet. But yeah, so coming back to the COP process, how does this fit in? The industry has started talking about also replacing crude oil as the feedstock material for plastics and moving to so-called bioplastics, meaning again, it's hydrocarbons, H and C, abundantly available in our planet and in the atmosphere. So you can make plastics from any kind of hydrocarbons, and it's just CNHs, right? So there are all these companies out there, novel companies that making plastics from algae, from bamboo, from anything you can think of, or like residue from the agricultural industry. So this is what is generally called bioplastics. They have a very small percentage of the world's production today, and why is that? Because they're much more expensive
Hmm.
in their unit economics than fossil fuel derived plastics, virgin plastics.
Yeah, it's a very good point and interesting one that like we can see its emissions. But then I was again thinking, I can see the emissions, but then my mind doesn't necessarily process that it came from fossil fuels again. I see the plastic problem from a different angle and not necessarily the fossil fuels problem. But
Yeah.
then your I loved the answer. So once we have the fossil fuels, and like you mentioned, there's about 4,000 different grades of it. Are all those 4,000 able to go into, don't want to say recycle, but go back into the circular economic model?
Mm. Well, uh, depends on how you ultimately define the circular economy model. But let's put it this way: there's at least two large distinctions you have to make between plastic. They're the so-called thermoplastics, and as the name suggests, thermo, heat, etc., means those can be remelted and
Hmm.
reshaped after usage. You know, those are by in a way ideal if you think about it, similar to glass, let's say, or metal. You can just melt it again and then reshape it. And then there are the so-called duroplasts, which are by definition have been built that you cannot, by injecting heat, make them melt again. So you can't really reshape them.
Hmm.
So they are built to last basically in a solid state, which make them in theory non-recyclable. They don't make up the largest share of the plastics today, but so if you make that big distinction between those two, you have to think of different circular models for those types of plastics. You know, in a world where you can talk about thermoplastics, and most of the all of the packaging plastics are actually thermoplastics, that would effectively mean away from this make, use, dispose, and incinerate or landfill, or worse, you come to make, use, reuse before you then recycle. And reuse, there are these multiple, not single-use plastic products, but you might have seen companies that are in the business of having solid or hard plastic eating cup, lunch boxes, etc. This is the stuff that you can wash and reuse multiple times before you actually throw it away in the end. And if you then throw it away, you can then recycle it. That's sort of the big circular model for the thermoplastics. For the duroplastics, the way to think about recycling them is, I mean, first of all, you shouldn't need to recycle them very soon. They're duro, they're hard, they should endure a long time, right? And there is a case to be made for making products last. There's also a form of helping circularity because you don't have to remake products all the time, right?
Can you give give example of thermo duroplastics?
Plastic from, I just have this example because it's close to my heart, epoxy in surfboards. Yeah.
Okay.
Those are plastics that are quite hard, resistant, and they can be they can no longer they cannot be recycling of
Yeah.
these.
Yeah.
In not
Uh,
recycling in the sense, Lala, of we remelt it and reshape it. What can
yeah.
happen, and that's sort of what I wanted to finish on, is you can also shred those plastic materials. Yeah, or take another example: plastic built into fiber reinforced plastic in blades of wind power plants.
Yeah.
You can think about either shredding it and making this filler material for other products. Not ideal, but at least you give it a second life. And the other point is, which the plastic industry has heavy debates on, is if you incinerate it in a way where you capture the emissions of the incineration, can that not also be part of a circular model? Because ultimately, from CO2, there's other things you can do, right? So this is the pathway of, let's say, for duroplastics, either use it in a secondary application, or also incinerate the material.
Hmm. Just for clarity of audience, the way I have learned it, the classification of plastic is thermoplastics and thermoset. So it's the same thing you described as
Yes,
duroplastics. So just don't want to
it's the same.
confuse thought.
It's
Yeah,
exactly because
this
the therm in the first place, even
yeah,
Europlastics thermosets have to be shaped using heat, right?
yeah, yeah,
But once they are set, the thermosets, they can no
yeah,
longer be reshaped, whereas
and
thermoplastics can be reshaped. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe
Um,
maybe that's the English word, and I just
yeah,
use the
that's
German words, you know.
yeah. So it can have different ways of getting it back into the circular economy model. So my question is that relating to that, like, are there any levels of like circular model? So like a very closer loop, a bigger loop, and then like different levels or anything like that.
They are, and it's great that you mentioned this, Lala, because a lot of the circularity debate is often focused on recycling, right?
Mm-hmm.
But circularity is so much more. And it's something that the capitalist system struggles a little bit. Like there's so-called R strategies, there are different R for reduce, reuse, recycle. These are the most commonly known: reduce, reuse, recycle. That's the 3R. But in fact, there is something I've seen up to 10 or 12 R strategy that
Mm-hmm.
includes something like reduce, replace, refuse, remodel, like the refurbish. There's a lot of R's that you can think of. So, and all with the same logic to increase the duration of a product once produced to be useful for humanity. That I think
Mm-hmm.
is the overarching goal of the circular economy, because we must decouple economic growth from resource consumption. We all know this, not just carbon, by the way, and not fossil fuels. And this is where circular economy is key. That is the answer to this, because you decouple consumption of products and goods, which humanity will still consume, from the consumption of ever having to inject new and fresh materials from extractive industries. So, um, and that is just, I want to really highlight this, because the biggest lever to start with, and it's something that especially the NGO side of things keeps on going back to, and especially now in the context of the plastic treaties negotiations worldwide that were going on, is we have to talk about reduction first
Mm-hmm.
and replacement where it makes sense. And reduction is obviously something like less plastic, that in a
Mm-hmm.
capitalistic world economy where businesses are built to grow, telling them to produce less is kind of like, yeah, trying to, I don't know, walk on water. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost, I mean, this, it's impossible in a way.
Yeah.
And therefore, the debate in the industry circles is rarely focusing on reduction. But if you think about it, the biggest lever we have is just let's not produce so much plastic in the first place, right? Um, and that it's a very good debate to have, because yeah, just one example. I just came back from a trip to Thailand at the beginning of January, and I was just amazed by how like nonchalant. There was no even thinking about giving me all these in 7-Elevens and also other chains. They give you a lot of plastic bags when you check out of a supermarket, even if it's just one milk, even if I can carry it in my hands, yeah. And there's just this always giving me double labeled. They are single-use plastic bags. This is a great example of reduce, right? We don't really need it, We don't really need this type of, and all this plastic wrapping around products that have natural wrapping, like fruits. They have a natural wrapping often. Why wrap them again in plastic? So I mean, there of course, when we get into the details, there can be arguments made even for wrapping that type of product, but I don't want to get too deep into it right now.
Yeah.
Just I think suffice to say, circularity is much more than just recycling.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so while you were talking about like how much it's going to be expensive or not, so like I was thinking, nothing is going to change unless it makes an economic sense, no matter how big like we want to change the world. Like I'm not talking from a personal perspective, but that's how the world works. No matter how the bigger the problem is, no matter how many infinite solutions do we have. So now let's come to the economic model of it. And when and how can it make more economic sense if it's still unfortunately cheaper to make something from the virgin plastics? So when and how will it make economic sense to do the circularity of plastics?
Yeah. So there's two answers to this. Let's say the pure capitalist free market view is where let's say, entrepreneurs and investors around the world spot this opportunity as a great business idea to move away from virgin plastic and just build alternatives in, let's say, recycling or bioplastics, as we mentioned already earlier, which will require you, however, in the beginning to overcome unfavorable economies of scale. Unit economics will be high, right? You build your first plant. You still have to compete in a world where companies have a choice to choose go for recycling versus virgin. So not only do you have this price challenge in the beginning, where you have to really like market at a premium the material to your customers, you also have the problem of quality. Yeah. So it's not like take the example of metal. That's a great example. Actually, steel is almost 100% recyclable. So and it gets recycled because it is cheaper to use recycled steel than use virgin steel. Yeah. Um, Now, when you do the same from a pure market point of view, you first have to get to the quality level that it can
Yeah.
replace virgin 101. Often it can't, for reasons we can get into. But then the second thing, it also has to compete on price, right? So quality and price are the big pure capitalistic levers of if you can make those two happen, like you have better or equal quality and equal or better price at reliable availability, also not to forget the third element,
Mm-hmm.
then the market would shift away automatically because it's just better business to do recycling over virgin, right? Like we see in steel. It's a great example because there a very mature recycling industry has been established. In plastic, not because these three things, even though investors and innovators have been trying for years to meet those three things in plastics, they have not been successful. And this is not like some, mama and papa shop recycling. There have been some real big money investments being made in recycling, and all may more or less failed for the unfavorable unit economics. And just one further point to that, if we live in a world now where drill baby drill is a thing and we're seemingly again moving toward extracting more fossil fuels, that will lead to lower prices of virgin plastic, right? Because the more crude oil you have, the more plastics you can refine, meaning the price of virgin plastics will go down. So again, you're not just operating in a vacuum when you're innovating and recycling. You have to always have an eye to what is happening on the virgin plastic market. So this is why I'm said that this is the first answer to your question is the market would have to can solve it if those three elements are in favor of recycled plastics. And so far, and we're speaking 70 years since humanity started producing plastics, nobody has come up with this kind of alternative. Yeah, which is why recycling remains quite of a niche today. So the other element of that answer then Alalala becomes is how can we make that business case work is well then obviously regulation comes into play because market forces are not something that's God given. It's something that we decide how we price products, how we decide how we price emissions into products. And this is, you see where I'm getting at, when we would price all the externalities that plastic is causing to humanity today in the virgin plastic production, CO2 emissions, but also the waste and the health repercussions that it has, then we would see that all of a sudden it becomes very expensive to use virgin plastic. So whenever you then move going back to the innovators and investors, they would have a better business case to also then, very importantly, scale up their technologies, make them more mature, make them more competitive. Like we've seen with renewable energies, it needed that kickstart
Mm-hmm.
to overcome this initial inertia, which was basically built into the linear systems. But once we did make that initial push, and now you can see the first results of better unit economics when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. Renewable energy production is much more competitive than fossil fuel energy creation.
Yeah. I am curious about two things. First is, doesn't we need more fossil fuels in the recycling process?
Your point is correct that when you actually collect plastic waste, you sort it, you wash it, shred it, there's a lot of energy still needed. But that energy consumption pales in comparison to what energy actually goes in the original production of virgin plastics. If you consider the extraction of fossil fuel from the earth crust, then then getting the crude oil to the refinery, and then from there on, you still are not at the finished plastic product, right? As I mentioned, there's only the base products that come out of a petrochemical refinery that then need to be further refined. So all these steps add up a huge energy load into the plastic, which makes it so wasteful if we only use it once, right? So yes, your point is correct that you still need energy to recycle plastics, but it's still so much less than producing new plastic. And actually, a study from Material Economics from Sweden, one of the leading circular economy research institutes, they made a really interesting study in 2018 comparing the prospects of carbon emission reduction from the advanced mechanical recycling technologies vis-a-vis other recycling technologies, and they said that yeah, the gains to be gained from modern advanced mechanical recycling to save carbon emissions is immense, especially compared to virgin plastics. So yes, you're right, but if you compare it to the virgin plastic production, it really doesn't matter, and it's so much better that we should definitely prefer recycling over producing new.
Yeah. And while you were talking about the circular economy model of it, the plastics and like why doesn't work out, you talked about the reasons why we are still not able to get that quality in plastics versus what we can do in glass or steel. Can you touch more on the reasons of why can't we get that quality today? And are there any possibilities of getting better quality plastics in future?
Yes, really interesting point. When you look deeper into it, you have to look into at what temperatures do you recycle steel and at what temperatures do you recycle glass, just to take these two examples. And of course, you have very high temperatures, right? We're talking, I think glass is that the melting point is around 1500 degrees Celsius. With steels, I'm not 100% sure where it is, but it should be very high. And at these temperatures, you can basically get rid of any stuff, let's say, that shouldn't be in there,
Yeah.
any impurities, any contaminations that sort of would make the product inferior if it stayed in the product. And
Hmm.
that points to the difference in plastics, right? Plastic melts, thermoplastic melt between 190, 250, 300 degrees Celsius. Now, if you just take the very good example of a bottle of motor oil, no, motor oil is built to resist temperatures, right? It comes in a plastic packaging. Now, so if you then melt a bottle with motor oil or that had motor oil in it, they will have some residue. Now, that motor oil won't disappear when you are heating it up to 200, 300 degrees Celsius. Quite worse, actually, you make it built into the new matrix of plastics. You're building in these crude oil, these motor oil elements into your new recycled plastics now. And you can imagine if you want to buy from a supermarket or anywhere a product that is wrapped for food consumption, you don't want to have anything anywhere near that was motor oil, right? So I think that is the key insight for why it is so difficult to recycle plastics because contamination and the process temperatures that's the elephant in the room. And now on the one hand, process temperature is quite low compared to the other recycling, as we just saw, so that's great. But because it's so low, contamination can persist in the product. And therefore, it's not safe to use for any new product necessarily. And so these impurities, if they remain, will make it inferior to virgin plastic. Yeah, and that's sort of the crux of the matter. And it's all connected. What I mentioned earlier. Of course, this can all be improved. Technology can improve. We can sort better. We can wash better. We can apply other technological processes to make plastic pure again. Yeah, once it's been used, but it all costs money, right? And if it costs money, it adds to the price of recycled plastic, and then you come up with a product that, for at least another decade, I would say, is going to be inferior because we haven't advanced with the technologies enough yet. So we need technological advancement in plastic recycling technologies to then really match virgin plastic one on one. But in the meantime, you have a product that is not of the exact same quality as virgin, and it's going to be more expensive. And now ask yourself, or the listeners should ask themselves, if I offer you to buy a new car and I offer you a recycled car, and I say the recycled car is going to be 20% more expensive than a new car, think 99%, if not 100% of your listeners will say, yeah, well, I'd rather go with the new car, because it is also seen as inferior. It is always seen, and there is an argument to it, even though when you go to the technical extremes today, you can show that already today we can recycle plastics in a quality that can really replace virgin one on one, even with purity levels, mechanical, chemical parameters. That is possible. It's just so expensive that nobody does it.
Yeah. I want to answer the new car versus old car. I love buying scarves that are made of recycled plastic. And they are almost 20 or 30% more expensive than the ordinary scarves. But my reason of buying those, also, I love the quality of it. They're much warmer. The particular ones I get in Ireland, they're much warmer compared to the other scarves. So if the quality is really nice and it gives me this pleasure of doing something good for the environment, maybe I will. But then, like, sorry, I get your point, what you were trying to say. But then, I
But
still didn't.
Lala, if I just may add a tiny thing to that,
Yeah.
because as you're sitting in front of a melting glacier, I think that is the absurdity of the world we live in, and I think future generations will look back at us and say, but why? How could that be that the extractive process of make, use, dispose was cheaper than the recycling, where you preserve resources? How can that be that you accept it? That as it's so ingrained that we don't question it, but it is, exactly what look behind you, the melting ice caps, and uh, generations will look back and say this is man-made. This is not something that is not a God-given physical law, that it is the way like this because it's pure economics. And therefore it's really stupid, if I may say, that we're living in these linear extractive industries, but this is how the world has been built. And that's why it's so hard to move away from it, because now they have a cost advantage over everything new that you try to do in circularity.
Yeah. I'm still not fully satisfied with your answer on how and when will it make economic sense. But then let's try to make economic sense of it by explaining more on touching more on what you're doing. So like let's explore the AI procurement business.
Happily.
What's that? Yeah, what's that and why is it really important on a
Yeah.
very like on a bigger scale? Yeah.
Yeah. To really understand this, I always give this pitch to also investors in this space. Is we really talked already a lot about the virgin plastics and crude oil. So think about it this way: how the crude oil industry today is extracting crude oils across the globe from very well-known sources. We know the exact chemical composition of the crude oil that then can go into, there's an example, the Venezuelan crude, the Brent Spar crude from the Northern Sea. They all come with unique chemical compositions. And
Yeah.
therefore the refineries, the next step in the processing around the world have been optimized for certain types of crude oil. Because that's the case, we can produce the petrochemical products in very consistent quantities and qualities because these industrial parks have been optimized for dealing with these kind of compositions. Now, so it's very stable, very consistent, and 365 days a year, very consistent volumes, right? It can even be manipulated, Lala, how much we're producing in oil and gas, right? Think of OPEC countries, think about the volumes. How much are we actually producing? Like they can decide to produce more or less. Yeah. Now, let's switch to the world of waste. Yeah? The world of waste is one of, I would say, never-ending complexities. We already touched upon the amount of plastic grades that are out there, right? Now,
Hmm.
that's only the beginning of the iceberg, yeah, because plastics then are usually refined with further additives to give it its unique qualities. Let's say flame retardant, odor absorber, like every kind of product you think, or even between you and me, where we are now. This booth has been built with plastic. This microphone, the computer, your glasses, everything plastic. So not only is it very hard, there's a sheer immense complexity has been multiplied by adding all these recipes to it. It's not just one crude oil now. All of a sudden, we have these thousands of grades of plastics plus additives, making them each a unique almost product. Then also think about the distribution of those products. Those products then go to consumers, right? So every household, in a way, is a little bit of a crude oil whale, yeah,
Hmm.
for waste, because
Yeah.
waste is essentially the equivalent to crude oil in the world of circular economy, if you think about it this
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And then you know why AI and digitization now comes up, because once you start looking at the world through the eyes of this, like how do we should move from crude oil to waste as the feedstock, the ultimate feedstock, you start thinking, okay, now how do I get enough waste in the right quantity and the right quality to a more or less centralized location so I can realize economies of scale and produce at scale recycled polymers of consistent quality and quantity, Yeah, this is the task that you have to meet, and consistent quality and quantity means you have to beat the production numbers that the petrochemical industry can do today in virgin plastic. Yeah, and that is a mammoth task. Considering that, just take the average recycler size in Europe today, that's about 15,000 tons of output. When now compare that to the output of plastic of a more or less petrochemical refinery, they're pumping out 1 million tons a year, yeah, if not more. So there you see the scale problem, the complexity in the supply chain. And so now sort of what Surplus does is what we set out and is okay, now we have to kind of reverse engineer this thing. It's not impossible because we have once produced these products. And if there was a magical wand that could just make sure that all these plastic products that have been used come back to its origin or to some central site, and we know perfectly well what kind of plastic was in it. If we had all that information, Lala, then we could design reuse, recycling strategies that could match with global supply chains. Now, obviously, we don't have that magic wand, but if I may say, that is exactly where Surplus unofficially has been titled. You know, we have to do this magic wand of reverse engineering from waste to reliable global supply chains in hydrocarbons from used hydrocarbons. And that today, nobody has even the data on it. So you have to start first digitizing those supply chains, the waste world, and then also based on that, make smart technology decisions. What do we do with those used hydrocarbons? Can we even use them, or how do we reshape them? And remember, this all must still make economic sense. But without data and digitization and AI, in my mind, you cannot build reliable supply chain because the AI element comes to it clearly. You can already see a artificial intelligence can much quicker analyze what waste type is where and when and how it can actually be done when a human would need a day or so to even realize what grade is this, where is the refining capacity for this or recycling capacity. That sort of should ideally be done by machines, and artificial intelligence therefore being a crucial element of building reliable supply chains and recycled plastics. Nobody is even questioning that, by the way. It's just a matter,
Hmm.
all right, now let's execute on that. Yeah.
Yeah. To make it simple for the audience, can I relate it the way we get the organic eggs in the grocery shopping, and like it's written the chickens for these eggs were fed this feed, and they were in a happy environment, something like
Yeah,
that.
in a way, what you're talking about is perfect traceability, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfectly knowing what went into this product, and that is a mammoth task. I say, Lela, just coming back from a trade fair in Amsterdam, actually, the plastic recycling trade fair of Europe, and I mean, there's so many product categories, Lela, where we haven't even begun analyzing where does the waste go. Most notable
Yeah.
example is the automotive industry, has never really took much interest in where do their cars end up when they're old and used, you know.
Yeah.
So now legislation is asking them to put more recycled plastics into their new products. And they're coming to the market and say, let's find out first where is our car going after it's been used. We're not even talking recycling yet. We're just talking where is the product after it has been used? Has it been shipped somewhere in the world? And so, see, that's the complexity. And then just adding one more layer because I have to, yeah, because then you're dealing with the waste. And let's imagine those car manufacturers can do that actually. They could directly locate where their cars are. Now, the cars that end in the waste streams are usually cars that are 15, 20 years old, right? The plastic used 20 years ago might not be the plastic you want to use today, right?
Yeah.
It might not even be legally permissible because there might be some stuff in it that today has been phased out. So think about all that. If you add all that up, where the waste is, how it's composed, and how do you get it, even if you knew where it is, how do you get it in a smart way to maybe central locations where you can then recycle it again? That is all unsolved today in the world of circularity, even though we know we have to shift there. For to
Hmm.
shift that, we have to make the economics work because then I do believe that capitalism is great at allocating capital and in innovations in the space where you expect a profit. Yeah. But if we don't make the economics work, this thing will forever struggle and we will never really get to recycling of plastics because virgin plastic will always have the upper hand.
Hmm. Yeah. So a lot from our discussion, I've gathered that like things are not great even in Europe, even in developed world. And then I'm just like coming from Pakistan, I'm just worried about really worried about developing countries where I'm sure the per capita consumption of plastic products might not be that much as it is for European countries. It's really different. Like we don't have everything packed in like bananas packed in, for example, plastics. But then, of course, we have nothing for the circular model. It's just the PET bottles that I know is understood in terms of plastics recycling in Pakistan. So like I'm just getting more worried how and like how can things get better in
Yeah.
developing countries like Pakistan, Thailand, and so on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the notion that stuff is so much better in the global north regarding
Yeah.
circularity, it's a false assumption
Hmm.
actually. We what is true is we're quite good at collecting and sorting the waste.
Yeah.
But already at sorting level, you could argue with lower labor costs and the global south, actually, still the human eye and the human hand is much better than any machine that's doing it. But so leave that aside. But I think the first thing I want to push back on is that we're so much better at recycling in the global north. You know, what is correct of what you said is that the per capita consumption of plastic is much higher than it is in the global south. I give you one data point. Germany, roundabout per capita consumption, 37 kgs of plastic packaging per person per year. Yeah. Now, 37 kg might not sound a lot, but if you take a plastic packaging, how light it is, think about how much
Yeah.
plastic product you have to have a 37 kg
It's
per
3 to 4
consumption.
for Pakistan.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And uh, and of course, countries that catch up on the GDP growth, obviously, usually increase their per capita growth, and that explains the whole, problem we're facing. That with global countries rising, plastic consumption will rise, as will the waste problem. So, um, and there is something to be said about collection, sorting, recycling infrastructure must be kickstarted from governments because again, the market economics otherwise don't sustain like investments in this space. There's also something that geography wise, let's not forget geography, it plays a huge part in the economies of scale for recycling. I give you one example that's maybe not Pakistan, but I know Pakistan is mountainous terrain to a large extent. But I always love to give the example of, I think it's Indonesia, which has, I believe, 12,000 islands, of which
Mm-hmm.
one
Yeah.
third is inhabited. Now, how do you make trucks? If you operate trucks to collect, how do
Yeah.
the economies work if you have to operate them on 3,000 islands? Yeah. And then you have minuscule amounts of plastic waste compared to what the global market needs. You still need to ship it somewhere. And then, so it all adds up. It all adds up. So just first, the notion is, though, I want to push back. Yes, we consume a lot more in the global north, but we're not necessarily greater at recycling. One
Mm-hmm.
more data point I have for you is from the plastic waste that we throw away in Germany that ends up being back into products. We're talking an abysmal 3 to 5%,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the actual recycling replacement rate, where a recycled polymer replaces a virgin polymer in the production. 3 to 5% post-consumer material, that is. Yeah. And now that is really bad if you consider that we applaud ourselves on being the greatest in recycling. Well, we're really not. We're really good at collecting it. That's true. And we're really good at keeping it out of eyesight of voters
What
so that
happens
voters are,
with it if it's not like if it's 3 to 4%? What's happening with the
well,
rest of it?
2/3 of plastic waste in Germany is still incinerated, right? So
Okay.
first of all, you make it disappear into another form of emission that is CO2. So
Yeah.
that's the first thing. It's incinerated. Second, while it's not landfilled in Germany, that's not allowed in Germany anymore. There is recycling, mechanical recycling, but again, the way you measure how it is recycled makes a whole lot of difference on the success rate. But there's also still a large amount that actually then gets exported to other countries where it is hopefully then actually recycled and not just illegally dumped in the environment. But this is the fate of plastic waste, Lala. When it doesn't get recycled, it's either incinerated, exported, landfilled, or worse.
Understanding why do other countries are accepting waste? Like every country must have their own waste to deal with, and I'm sure the countries which are accepting waste, they're not really great with managing their respective waste. So what's the benefit for them? What's the incentive for them?
So there's the answer to that is twofold. So the you're asking for the incentive of other countries to take in plastic waste. Well,
Yeah.
uh, it number one, it can be a business, right? Because if you have a hard to recycle plastic waste in Europe, let's say, or the
Mm-hmm.
United States, and somebody somewhere is offering you money for taking this, which
Mm-hmm.
usually doesn't. Something is hard to recycle. Usually people are not paying for this feedstock. So you have to pay them to take it. Now already
Mm-hmm.
you have a business, right? So let's just take for a moment the worst case scenario is where you have really illegal waste shipments, which is still happening, where somebody somewhere in the world says, or a trader or something in between says, yeah, dear plant, recycling plant, or dear like sorting plant, I take your plastic waste. You pay me $100 per ton, and I take care of it, right? So the plant
Okay.
says, great, stuff is gone. The trader goes on to say, yeah, I have maybe trades it to someone else, and that trader in turn has someone in Indonesia who says, yeah, I can take that waste, I can recycle it. Yeah. Now, exactly. When they get paid for, and again, remember, you have to get paid to take this feedstock. Unlike normally where you buy for your feedstock, you pay for your feedstock. So, and then what happens is, yeah, you get paid, and 100, let's say, ends up being even $60 per ton of material. If you can then somehow make that material go away in your home country, and by
Mm-hmm.
go away, I mean not incineration, but wild plastic landfilling illegally, dropping the material somewhere and where, authorities are not watching. This is essentially how plastic pollution is happening, right? Because in theory, it shouldn't happen. It should all be well controlled. But in practice, it doesn't because the customs that are usually, at least in Germany and other countries, the authorities to check whether or not the recipient can actually recycle the plastic waste are not, then the US customs is not going to travel to Indonesia, check on the plant somewhere in the hinterland of Jakarta, and then say, oh, it's not being recycled. So it is ultimately the recipient country, and this is why a lot of countries in the global south have also heavily restricted now the acceptance of plastic waste. Not all of it, Lala, because that's the second layer to your question is it would be a wrong assumption to say every plastic waste that is exported is illegal or is like some kind of hard to recycle material. In fact, I can speak openly ourselves. We at Surplus, we export engineering plastic waste of high value where the buyer actually pays for the material. So it's not that they get money to take it. The buyer pays for the material because the scrap of Europe is still valuable to then be recycled in Asia and sold to Asian buyers. And that's still better business than buying virgin. This in certain plastic grade, that is actually the reality. So-called engineering plastics, really high value plastics. But in
Oh.
packaging plastics, which is really the problem for the world, I would say, this is the problem that packaging plastics and low quality grades, mostly the flexible packagings, LDPE, contaminated, and nobody really wants to have that stuff because the
Mm-hmm.
demand is so low for the recyclate. The quality coming out is therefore low. Therefore, it's a vicious cycle downward, and then yeah, either gets incinerated, landfilled, or worse. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so like let's wrap it up with our audience by now would be so confused, like, okay, everything is happening on a
Hopefully
business
not.
level. No, I mean, they would be like, okay, so let me finish my question. They were like, okay, everything is happening at a business level, so much government policies, standards, everything involved, and only then the problem would be solved. What can they do as consumers? So,
Hmm.
because like, um, I'm not sure we talked anything that they can help with, the consumer could
Hmm.
help with by, like, I understand sorting. Okay, let's help with the sorting, but then is there
Yeah.
more to it? And like, please focus on the developing versus developed world
Yes.
angle on it as well.
Yes. Happily. I mean, I think the first point, hopefully, that your listeners get from this conversation is that the complexity is such
Hmm.
that the individual consumer can't really change much.
Yeah,
That's industrial policy, market policies to really change how products are designed. But
yeah.
I'm going to get to. I'm just allow me to. I just wanted to say, first level. So your listeners shouldn't directly feel bad about it, that it's upon them to solve this problem. I would heavily argue against that. That is not the
Yeah.
consumer who is the main focus of the change debate here. That is a very convenient red herring, I would say sometimes
Yeah.
for some players. But it's very important, Lala, that this message gets across because it is not the
Yeah.
consumer who's the main culprit. And do not let the industry tell you that you, Lala, are bad because you in Pakistan are not collecting properly or you in Indonesia are not collecting properly. That is almost borderline chauvinist. Yeah. To
Yeah.
say, oh, it's the global south that is causing this problem because they don't know how to recycle. That's very chauvinist actually. And you hear these arguments.
Yeah.
So, but there is something we can do. And let me start with what you can do in the global south. So, the first thing is, of course, remember the circular strategies is reduce, right? Do you really need to go to the supermarket without your own reusable bag? Um, you can choose to take a bag with you, right? Even though this might not, people will look at you funny because they say, why don't you just take those single-use plastic bags? Like I did exactly that in Thailand, yeah? And Thailand's not necessarily, non-developed country, but I just, I said to these guys, no, I don't need the plastic bag. I have here my own bag. That's a very simple thing you can do, you know? And do you really need that coffee to go? Or can you not take that 5 minutes in your day, or if you drink tea, can you not take that 5 minutes in your day? And even if you can't take because you're on a rush to go to work, well, why don't you take your reusable cup with you? It's another example. Or another great example, I think, is also the all this takeaway food. You know, again, everything in Thailand was wrapped in plastic, like to the extent that I said to my wife, man, I mean, the country is beautiful, but this is painful. I come back here, this is really painful. Um, Again, here, there are systems out there. You can work on reusable packaging, and so it's really the mindset question that, yes, you as an individual, the individual entrepreneur, ask yourself, is plastic really first my number one material I should use? And if so, yeah, are there ways to reduce the consumption of plastic in my products? And that is everything that we can do. And at a second level, I would say if you're fortunate enough to live in a country with a representative system where you can actually influence policies, politics through the voting, then I would always say challenge your representatives on these questions. Like what are you doing about this? And this is of course the second layer because ultimately that is where, in my mind, the level lies. These are the small changes we can do, but they are still minuscule with regard to the bigger changes, like how we design cars, how do we design these earphones. This is something that your choices as a consumer will not really make a difference
Mm-hmm.
for a very long time. Even if, Lala, you said earlier, oh yeah, I'm willing to buy more for my scarf, but that
Mm-hmm.
is the so-called green premium.
Yeah.
If people are suffering in the world economy and they're like having to optimize their budgets, they will not be willing to pay 20% more for their products, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. And quite frankly, there's not so much difference to what you can do in the global north about this. It's the same thing in the end, reduce, refuse, and lobby your representatives that they make sure that we change the market fundamentals of the plastics economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just at the end, can you give a very powerful example of a very like, or maybe a success story of something that you might have observed during your experience, like something going back into the circular economy, a
Yes.
recycled product, like
Yes.
on a very bigger level, or that we can, yeah.
Yeah, I give your listeners two examples, one that is maybe more common knowledge and one that is maybe more hidden, a hidden champion. So the very powerful example is that of the PET bottles from
Mm-hmm.
the return systems that you have in many countries, but even where you don't have return systems, often through informal
Yeah.
waste collections, they get collected and then recycled many times over into a new product. So the state-of-the-art recycling in PET bottles, by the way, allows for 6 to 8 cycles
Wow.
of reusing that bottle.
Yeah.
And no, sorry, to be correct, to recycle that bottle. If you were even to build the bottle in a more durable way with thicker walls, you can first think of refilling them before you
Yeah.
recycle them. So there's an abundance still of opportunities, but this is a great example where the world has actually managed to make
Yeah.
this work. In PET bottles, we would say we have the technology, we have actually solved the problem in a way. And no, it doesn't
Yeah.
stop there, Lala, because uh, especially outdoor brands, of which I'm not going to name now, but let's say, the outdoor brands for the clothing. Some of them
You can
bought,
name the brands. It's okay.
okay, like let's say Patagonia,
Yeah.
Ford, Fjällräven, great brands.
Yeah.
They have because they also have a premium on their product. They're quite expensive.
Yeah.
Um, they actually have their marketing in. It's more of a marketing topic. They say, yeah, we want to move away from virgin fiber, so they look to find recycled PET, and you can PET is out of polyester, can actually go also into clothing. And you mentioned your scarf, so this is something where you have a stellar example where you can really show that plastic is recyclable, and it can be
Hmm.
of such good quality that it can, without any compromises, replace virgin plastics. That is maybe the stellar example as something that should make all of you hopeful out there. It
Yeah.
is, it is, I would always say, if we aspire to fly to the Mars as humanity, yeah, we've already flown to the moon. I would actually say it was harder to fly to the moon than to make plastics more circular. It is a pure question of market incentives and then will to make this happen. Because giving you the second example, less known probably to you, one of our shareholders is a company from Germany. It's a plastic conversion company. They're in the business of energy chains and joints, yeah, like for robots and automatics. So the people, your listeners will not know the brand, but it's a big company. Anyway, they have established a take-back system for their polyamide 6 energy chains. So when the chains comes to the end of their lives, they take them back, they shred them, they wash them, they regranulate them, and they put them back into the same product at close to zero loss of performance. Yeah. It is more expensive than virgin, but because it's a family-owned business and the owner said to us, we want to do this as a contribution to making the world a better place and also of being more better stewards of our planet, we are going to do this. We're going to show the world that in a less known plastic category, we can recycle the waste in a way that it can replace virgin. And there you have it. And if you can do it in polyamide 6, probably is and plastic that your listeners will not know, then I tell you, you can do it in other thermoplastics as well. It
Yeah.
is, again, just a question of will and the market economics to work out. So hopefully that is the good message with which I can leave you, that it is very much possible and it's definitely easier than landing a man on the moon or a
Yeah.
woman for that matter.
Yeah, and I'll just add one last thing that in Pakistan as well, and like I was shocked to read this, 99% of PET bottles are recycled. And I know it's not a nicer supply chain and process of it, how it happens, but then again, it's possible, and like we also do it. Um,
And
that's
why is
it.
that, Lala, in Pakistan? Because you probably get some money for the PET bottles
Yeah,
when you pick them, right?
yeah,
Business. There you have it.
yeah,
That's the,
yeah.
just think of the in Pakistan. That's how it works. It works. If it works in
Well,
Pakistan, it works
it's
anywhere,
yeah,
right?
it's business and then interest from big brands who don't want to be labeled. Yeah. And
But
even the
maybe,
report is from one of the brands. So
maybe to rephrase a great entertainer from the United States that is long dead now, but Frank Sinatra, you might, well, maybe your listeners know, but in his famous song, he said, "If you can make it there, you'll make it anywhere. If you can make it in Pakistan, you can make
yeah,
it anywhere." You know,
exactly. If we can and if we can make pet in Pakistan, like it could be other uh pa-
100%, Lala. And
yeah,
I assure you, even in those most pristine, remote places of the world where we do manage to get those plastics products in the first place, right? I mean, after
yeah,
all, they're being sold there. So it is not impossible also to get them back. It is a
yeah,
question of I can just repeat myself, market and will. It is
yeah,
not as difficult as landing on the moon to make
yeah,
plastics more circular and stop the constant influx of material into the environment.
yeah. Thank you so much, Christian, for this. It was indeed a different podcast talking more about the solution and framework of solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lala. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.